across Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So this includes our partnership with organizations like WHO, academics, to develop society-wide approaches to fighting misinformation. I also had the honor to be part of the Facebook team that worked with policy to develop this important research on African feminist use of data. So this research was actually a partnership between two teams at Facebook that I really want to quickly highlight because I think they're very relevant to this conversation. So the first team was our Project 17 team that is represented by my colleague Braun, who's on the audience, and I'm sure we'll have the opportunity to share some insights. So Project 17 was launched in 2018 to build the partnerships and programs that would enable Facebook to be a leading driver of progress towards the UN Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, with the mission of giving people and organizations the power to achieve the SDGs. Project 17 seeks to help external organizations leverage Facebook's superpowers to advance their SDG investment and programs, including through critical research like this project, and we are here to learn more today. And then the second team that supported this project was our human rights team that's headed by Mazuba, who unfortunately was unable to make it to this call. So this is the human rights public policy team, and Mazuba heads our team in Africa, Middle East, and Turkey. And this is a new team inside Facebook, but it's a team that very much speaks to Facebook commitment to human rights. As some of you might have seen, we've launched a couple of weeks ago our corporate policy around human rights, and Mazuba's team, as well as many global teams, are working very closely to ensure that Facebook can be a better platform where human rights are respected, and we as a company can do more in terms of protecting vulnerable groups in the company. And I think going more than protecting vulnerable groups in the company, also being seeing how Facebook's superpowers or Facebook's potential can be used by marginalized groups to make sure that their rights are heard. So again, we're very excited to be part of this conversation today, to learn from you all, and also I want to send my utmost thanks to the whole policy team, Nina, Chanay, Garnet, Nima, for all the amazing work they've done on this research project. Really looking forward to learning from you all and answering any questions you might have regarding Facebook's involvement in this work. I'll pass it back to you, Garnet.
All right, thank you so much for your short presentation. I'm sure a lot of people here are really interested in hearing more about Facebook's involvement with like feminist groups and human rights as a whole. And yeah, the Q&A session will be up for that. And so for the next segment in this webinar, I will be doing a presentation of the Afrofeminist Data Futures report. Yeah, this will take about 5 to 6 minutes. And I'll turn off my video. Yeah, so the Afrofeminist Data Futures research. So we conducted this research with African feminist movements and organizations from Anglophone, Francophone, and Lusophone speaking regions of the continent. So that's in Sub-Saharan Africa, as it's referred to. And, sorry, just technical difficulties. There you go. And so we wanted to understand the kind of data that feminist organizations and groups and feminists were collecting. And so we found 4 types of data that they were collecting. We had incidence and prevalence data, we had social media metrics, knowledge, perceptions, and behavior data. And we wanted to understand what they use this data for. And they listed reasons such as advocacy and awareness building, policy making and influencing, fundraising and needs assessment, and program and impact measurement. This is because data is an important tool for measuring different aspects that I've just mentioned here. And since we wanted to understand the kind of online tools that they were using, because we're also majorly interested in digital data. We polled feminists and feminist groups on the online tools and technology that they used. And these are some of the examples of the tools that they use in their work, whether it's for organizing or just their day-to-day work. And so we found out that there are so many challenges to data use, and the first one being digital literacy. So as a whole, a lot of feminist organizations did not know how to use and manipulate data for their work. And there was also the issue of language barriers. This was especially with the Francophone, Lusophone respondents from Tanzania, where they talked about how a lot of the data made available for use is in English. And this locks out a lot of feminist organizations from working with this data. And then there was the issue of connectivity. So we know that a lot of movements are online currently, but then this affects a lot that can be done by feminist movements because of the digital divide. And with the digital divide, it also affects the kind of data that can be collected online, because you have such a large population of people that are not online. And then we also have the time lag between large-scale national surveys. If you are African, you know that national surveys are done periodically. It could be between 5 years or 3 years. And often it depends on donor funds. When such funds are not available, these surveys are not done. And in the case where they're done, the data is not digitized and made accessible to people. There's some sort of gatekeeping that is being done by governments and also by the private sector, where they collect data on communities on the continent, but they sell this data and don't make it available for use. We also had the deprioritization of feminist causes, where you find that feminist issues such as abortion and abortion rights, LGBTQ rights are not a priority for African governments. And in this case, when the data is not collected on these issues, then there's no way to visibilize these challenges that people are facing. You also have donor agendas where feminist movements and organizations are all clamoring to access the same pool of funds. And we found that donors actually encourage this competition, which is not healthy for feminist movements on the continent. We also had the re-traumatization of respondents. This is especially when feminists are researching issues such as gender-based violence, where victims do not want to talk about their experiences, they do not want to relive it. So there's the issue of collecting data on such challenges, secure storage of data and data protection and privacy. So this is also part of digital literacy, where when people collect data, and this could include sensitive information with personal identifiable information, they do not know how to store it. We had a case where a respondent talked of storing data they collected in locked cupboards, and in contexts where governments are authoritarian and they do office raids, this is a huge risk. And it's mostly because they do not know the practices around protecting people's data. And there was also the focus on quantitative data as rigorous. If you follow a lot of work by African feminists on the continent, you find that they collect and share a lot of stories that give light into issues on the continent. But then when it comes to research, this kind of data in the form of storytelling is not prioritized, because numbers are seen as more weighty. Quantitative data is valued over qualitative accounts. And a huge issue people talked about was shadow banning, where platforms like Instagram and Facebook block or suspend accounts run by feminists and feminist movements. And this whole process is a black box. So sometimes feminist organizations do not even know when they are shadow banned. And this happens when they're talking about conversations that are deemed sensitive within society. could be body positivity, could be sex work, and could be sex education, such issues. We also have treatment of women of color by technology platforms. I'm sure a lot of us have been following what went on with the Google AI research team, where Dr. Timnit Gebru was fired from her job. And it's not just an isolated issue, it's an issue where women of color find it hard to navigate technology platforms. And in that way, they also find it hard to give feedback that would reflect people like them. And the biggest issue currently that women are facing using online platforms for collecting data is online gender-based violence. So there has been an increase in online abuse and harassment against women online, and especially as more and more people came online because of the pandemic. So the rates of online gender-based violence increased also. And so in light of these challenges, we thought of different ways that we could solve these issues. And I think the biggest and most immediate need for feminists right now is funding. This is in terms of feminist research and data training initiatives. So feminists on the continent are not data literate. We need more initiatives that train them on how to collect data, how to analyze this data, how to securely store this data. We need more funding for feminist research. We already saw that feminist issues are not prioritized. So we need money. And also effective knowledge sharing partnerships. This is especially between feminist movements on the continent. We talked about how feminists are competing for funds in this space, and just having partnerships between these feminists where they can share data with each other and they're not replicating the work another feminist organization is doing could be really important. And with these partnerships, feminists can control the way that they collect data. They can use feminist principles like accountability and privacy and consent to govern this data. And in the long term, we recommend the strengthening of women's safety online. We have found that online gender-based violence is huge, especially in feminist communities on the continent. And this should be a priority for platforms right now. And also leveraging feminist partnerships and principles. Listen to feminists, use feminist principles of the internet like accountability and consent when collecting data, and also charting paths to feminist data governance. So feminist data governance would account for the colonial histories that our continent has, would check on the power balances, and would center collecting of feminist data. Thank you. Okay, so I guess it's it's also kind of awkward that I'm the one who finishes the presentation and also leads to the discussion on the presentation I just made. And I'm going to first introduce our panelists on screen. I'm just going to wait for them to all. Yep, are we ready? Okay, I see we're ready. Just a moment. So we have 5 panelists with us today. We have Nima. Nima Iyer is the founder of Policy and one half of the podcast Terms and Conditions. She's also a visual artist. You can follow her on Instagram at Nima Scribbles. We have Anuli Ngozi Okonji. Anuli is a 22-year-old activist and from Nigeria who's committed to affirming young women's rights. She's also the founder of Through the Eyes of African Women. We have Chenai Chair. Chenai is a special advisor for Africa innovation at Mozilla. She's also a digital policy and gender researcher with extensive experience in researching the impact of technology in society. And we have Catherine Dignazio. Catherine is one of the authors of Data Feminism. I'm really excited about this part. And she's the director of the Data and Feminism Lab and an assistant professor at MIT She's interested in creative ways to democratize data science for social justice. And lastly, we have Lauren Klein. She's a co-author for Data Feminism and assistant professor at Emory University. She works at the intersection of digital humanities, data science, and early American literature. Such an interesting mix. Yeah. So as I've introduced you all, I'm just gonna dive into the questions. My first question is to Nima and Chennai. So as we did this research, can you tell us what was most shocking to you? What surprised you most, and what stood out to you most about this research?
Sure, I can go first. Thank you so much, Garnet. Thank you for the presentation. Thank you for the question. So for me, I come from a background working in ICT for D, which, you know, for a long time has been dominated by non-African voices. I worked in projects looking at, you know, using, you know, back in the day, using SMS, and then I transitioned to interactive voice response. And I've been involved in many different data projects working on data literacy, digital literacy. But I think for me, what I thought was quite interesting was that we did this research in French and in Portuguese. And I have very basic French and I have no Portuguese knowledge whatsoever. And of course, our Portuguese research took us to working with feminist movements in Mozambique and in Angola. And this really opened up my eyes to the bias that I have, because all my knowledge is, of course, from working in English and from working with Anglophone countries. And I found it very interesting, perhaps not shocking, but it was very interesting in that where the different movements are in terms of using data and technology. So Anglophone countries, you know, had a much higher knowledge about different issues, about the positive and the negative aspects of technology and data governance. And then you would see that Francophone countries had some understanding. And then in some ways, I did feel like Lusophone, that's Portuguese-speaking countries, were sort of neglected. I felt that you know, through all my readings, I had very rarely come across content that was from these different countries. And it was also very interesting to see the different issues that they faced with. For example, the woman that we spoke to in Angola had to resort to Brazilian feminist content to learn about feminism. And they also felt very alone, that they didn't know that there were other feminists in their own country just because of access and infrastructure issues. And I just thought that was so interesting that, you know, we are all working on the African continent, but some people have been left behind and have to look for resources from a whole different continent. And that really opened up my eyes to the impacts of colonization till today. And of course, you know, there's this growth of decolonial studies, but when you see it that, you know, like these are our neighbors and we're not working together at all because we are separated by these languages, I thought that for me, that was very shocking to learn about my own biases in the work that I do. And so now I want to focus some more of our resources in having more conversations with these countries and just learning more and seeing how we can bridge the different gaps that we have. So that was my take. Over to you, Chennai.
Thanks, Nima. So I just want to apologize quickly to everybody because this is one of the things that we find technical difficulties. So some of the panelists might not be able to put up their videos because of something that happens with Zoom, but it leads into the challenges that I found. So I think what was surprising for me in this work is a confirmation of some of the issues that I had thought about in terms of like, why weren't, first of all, are feminist movements using data at all? And then you realize it's not that they're not using data, but it's just that the gatekeeping that happens with access to data, and also just, you know, the lack of support and thinking from a feminist perspective of like, these organizations need data, how do we support them? And the lack of support, actually, we often, you know, this purpose of this research was looking at how social media companies can provide data. And then when you realize that some of us work in spaces and institutions where we collect large amounts of data, but there hasn't been a collaboration or a feed into other feminist movements who work on other issues that data may provide for. So to the point that Nima raised around like my own bias. There was a lot of like realization and reflexivity, because one of the feminist principles of research is always reflection. But it was kind of realizing how much we subconsciously gatekeep information because we have access to knowledge and we operate in one circle of the technical space. So we think kind of everybody has the same information. And then when we were speaking to these feminist organizations, you know, I just really sat there and thought, I've been part of organizations that have done demographic studies in like about 12 African countries. And the resources of information that they were looking at were national statistics that are done every 10 years, World Health Organization data that's collected when it's collected. And also there's like anecdotal studies of someone who probably is looking for information and they get a grant and they conduct research, but they work with feminist organizations because they're looking for a particular subset of people, but they don't have access to that final information. So for me, what it made me realize, you know, like a lot of the surprising stuff was more so for practices that we have as the research community, practices that we have as data stewards, people who actually collect the data. And that I think we are trying to actually, the point of change is more so really trying to find more cross-collaborative engagements with people who work on different issues as feminist organizations to actually support each other in terms of like, this is the data that we have. And then this is also like the advocacy that can be done on it. And also basically peer-to-peer learning in terms of thinking about like, most feminist organizations are organizing online, but how are they thinking about the information that they're collecting from the people who are part of their communities? How are they protecting the information that they have? Are they even thinking about this? And as a member of like Feministing While African, one of like a group that's mainly been moderated on WhatsApp, it really made me think about like, how then do we, on the one hand, improve the kind of engagement that we have from a digital space and the data we need, but on the other hand, what are the challenges that we face in actually trying to understand, like basically understand the data that we hold and the kind of impact that it has. So for me, those are my personal reflections on some of like the surprises that I found with the research, reflecting on it from like that research community. And I really implore everyone who comes from different backgrounds to really look at this research, especially if you're in the research community, to think about how do you communicate with the communities that you're trying to affect change with, and in some cases for. So yeah, those are the interesting findings for me, Garnet.
And I definitely relate on noticing your biases when going through the research. I remember when we were looking at the data from Lusophone Africa, that is Mozambique and Angola, and respondents are talking about how they use Facebook to connect with other feminists in Brazil because that's where they can get data from. And in my head, I'd gone through this research thinking, okay, Facebook is a big bad tech, you know. And just a reminder to our attendees, you can ask your questions in the chat box, and we will go through them after the first round of panelists is done. And so my next question is for Catherine and Lauren. Like I said before, Catherine and Lauren wrote Data Feminism. And for audience members who are unfamiliar with the concept of data feminism, could you please describe it for us in brief?
Sure, this is Catherine. Hi, everybody. I'll start and then I will pass to Lauren to continue. So first, we just want to say thank you so much for having us, and we're so honored that you're drawing from our work in this report, and it's a really important report, and I've learned a lot from reading it. So just to summarize briefly, and I'm actually going to put in the chat as well for people some infographics that explain the principles of data feminism, and actually we do have them in multiple languages, so that might be helpful. So, you know, Lauren and I came together around this question. You know, both of us work with data in various ways, which are both sort of scholarly and designerly and activist, sort of all at the same time. And we came together around the really broad question, in a sense, of what would an intersectional feminist data science look like? Like, what would it look like to bring to bear intersectional feminist thought on doing the work of data, and even just on our approach to data science and to data practices generally. And one of the things I think I want to say here is when we say intersectional feminist, what we're drawing on really in the book is the feminism of Black feminists specifically, mainly in the US context. So these are folks like Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality. We also talk a lot about the concept from Patricia Hill Collins of the matrix of domination, which describes the scales of unequal privilege and oppression. And our vision of feminism that comes from these really important thinkers is a feminism that is not only about women, and of course not even only about gender, because the really important point that these theorists make is that we have to look at the intersection of multiple forces of power, like sexism, of course, but also with racism, also with colonialism, also with imperialism and these other forces. And so that was really notable to me too in reading the report, is I saw that similar sort of intersectional approach in the report, and that really resonates, I think, with the spirit in which we wrote Data Feminism. Is like, we can't just be looking at one sort of axis of oppression at a time. And so when Lauren and I came together, we looked across a wide range of fields. You know, one of the exciting things is there's a lot of feminist work in a lot of different fields. And what we did is we synthesized from that scan 7 principles, 7 feminist principles for doing data science in basically a feminist way. And that's what's in the infographics that I pointed you all to. And it's also how the book is organized. So each book, each chapter in the book is one of these principles and talks about it and kind of introduces it and shows examples of what it looks like to sort of do that principle. And so the principles are: examine power, challenge power, rethink binaries and hierarchies, elevate emotion and embodiment, embrace pluralism, consider context, and make labor visible. And so maybe like the one thing I'll point out there is those first 2 principles, examine power and challenge power. For us, this is what's really at the core, in a sense, of the feminist project, is sort of examining unequal power structures in society and then pushing back on those, challenging those inequalities that are unjust and unfair. And so we think about how might we really make inequality the focal point of data science and really do data science in a way that can challenge those inequalities. So maybe here I'll pass to Lauren to build on that.
Thanks so much, Catherine, and thanks for this invitation to be here. Like Catherine said, we're just so honored that you would invite us to this conversation, which is so important. And this report already, I think, has done so much amazing work in sort of telling us what we need to know to move forward. I think one of the things that I'll just do really briefly in my comments is try to expand a little bit on the principles that we talk about in the book and try to call your attention to where we think some of the things that we sort of speculate about in the book are actually borne out or demonstrated in the report. So one of the points that Catherine sort of alluded to is that our book is very US focused, and we were explicit about that because that's sort of our area of expertise. And we also recognized that we couldn't realistically cover the whole world in a single book. But we did try to make the point that feminist data practices and data feminism, it looks different in different places, right? You know, one of the important things to do is to sort of understand where you are in the world and look around and figure out sort of what these practices look like in a way that makes sense for that particular location or region. You know, and I think that we see this sort of being borne out in the information that's provided in the report. You know, the other thing that I hope has sort of come through already in what Catherine has said and what I've begun to say is that we also didn't want to sort of claim a single way of doing data feminism for everyone, right? Every single person has their own experience of, on the one hand, privileges, and the other hand, oppressions that they encounter in the world. The same is true for different groups, for people in different locations. And again, it was really important to us not to make universal claims, but instead to sort of lay some of the groundwork for thinking about how additional people might also contribute to this project, which again, I feel like I should emphasize, began well before this book came to be. And we really hope, and obviously, there's already indications that it is continuing after us. The one thing that I do think, maybe we can draw from the book and sort of connect to this report is that the first step in almost all contexts is to sort of know what's out there already, right? If your goal is to intervene or improve or sort of rectify imbalances of power or asymmetries of data collection and extraction or whatever, the first step in any effort anywhere is to get the lay of the land. And I think that's one of the things that this report does really well and presents in such a clear and thorough way to all of us readers who benefit almost immediately just by turning its pages. More specifically, I think one of the things that was really inspiring to us is sort of how this report and everyone who was involved really sort of inhabited this idea of collaboration, this idea that partnerships need to come from this ethos of collaboration and reflexivity and understanding sort of where imbalances of power and biases and everything show up even within research projects, and taking active steps to try to recognize and then sort of mitigate where those power imbalances take place. So this relates to things like what Chennai said about data stewardship, really recognizing the responsibility that comes from collecting data, taking sort of control, not in a power sense, but just sort of like ownership and responsibility for keeping these data, especially when they relate to personal, private, potentially, information that could be damaging or harmful if it regains sort of falls into different hands. Thinking about things like knowledge transfer, right? This recognition that everyone brings something to a collaboration and there never should be this one-way exchange, that everyone should be learning something from everyone else. And then finally, this relates to a point that Garnett said, also relating to funding, right? Like, we do not want collaborations that have sort of a one-way funding stream that is top-down coming from corporations to communities. We need to think about ways that make the funding and sort of financial support of projects sustainable, ongoing, and also that sort of authorizes the communities themselves to decide what to do with the money that's coming from outside. I'm just looking down my list of points, and I want to make sure that there's time to discuss everything else. Oh, the one thing that I did want to say that I thought was really, really important here is sort of how the report recognizes that like collecting data and more data is not always the solution, right? And this is something that we do talk about in the book as well, that the instinct, especially for people in technical fields, who recognize the sort of generative power of data, the impulse is to be like, oh, if we could just get data that would document these issues, we could create change or we could affect change. But in many ways, and sometimes at the same time, like the same data that you collect to use for change, positive change in one direction, can have negative impacts in the other. And so to always be thinking about the potential for harm, the concerns about privacy, and issues that go around with sort of data protection and privacy, pretty much these questions need to be thought through with any data collection or data analysis task. So maybe I'll just stop there and just thank everyone involved in this project for this amazing work. And I'm really interested to hear what the rest of the panelists have to say.
Right, and I totally agree with what you're saying on collecting more data is not always the solution, especially when it comes to issues like surveillance. And in our report, we call this like the, what did I say? Sorry, I've forgotten the exact term we used, but it was, yeah, I've forgotten, it's fine. And I also, on another point, you talked about examining the context, which is one of the principles of data feminism. And I remember one of the questions somebody asked us was, why did we use data feminism, which is a Western concept, in a research that's based in Africa? And just when you go through the principles of data feminism, it just encompasses everything we wanted to talk about. And I have a follow-up question for Catherine and Lauren. Are you currently seeing data feminism being practiced within governments, donors, and even grassroots movements? And if you aren't, how can we incentivize those different groups to use the concept of data feminism?
Thanks for that question, Garnet. We are, I would say we are seeing it more with practitioners, like in a sense, individuals picking it up. There is a group in the United States called the Civic Software Foundation, which is a nonprofit, and they have actually designed a new program. They're like kind of like a open data and software consulting firm, and they've designed a new program informed by the principles of data feminism, which is all around providing context around open and public data. And so like they're doing some really interesting work to figure out what it looks like to consider context, for example. We've seen some uptick in use by, I would say, sort of grassroots organizations, less in government. However, in fact, this week, I'm going to be on a panel with a representative from US Congress who is showing up to a panel about data feminism. So that's encouraging. I think we would love to see more interest from the policy side. And I've been noticing here that like folks are putting in some of the really interesting feminist policies that are coming out of Canada, for example, that are using gender as a central lens of policy analysis. And so, yeah, I mean, I think one of the things we get asked for is kind of like a little bit more of like concrete details. Oh, like of how do I do this in my specific context or in this specific workplace? And I think we kept the principles sort of intentionally broad so that people might use them as guideposts, but that they don't necessarily prescribe, like a 10-point plan to get there, to realizing the principles. And partially that's just because we couldn't know that for people in advance, because we don't know all the people and all the context. But also because, a lot of this is about, I think, experimentation. Like it's like about asking the question, what happens when we approach the work of data science and the governance of data and even like the funding models for data with these principles? What has to change? And we tried to outline some of the things that have to change, but there's probably a lot more that we did not foresee that needs to change. And so a lot of this needs to happen through exactly this kind of uptake and experimentation, and honestly modification and situating. That is the work that you all are doing, which we see as like just tremendously exciting for us to see data feminism forwarded in this way. Lauren, do you want to say more about that too?
No, I'm just nodding my head because you pretty much took the words out of my mouth.
Okay, so on to our last panelist, Anuli. So Anuli is the founder of Through the Eyes of African Women, and she has a lot of experience engaging with African feminist organizations. So Anuli, could you tell us how you currently use data and tech for feminist movement building, and how tech has helped shape the experience of African movements, African feminist movements?
Yeah, thank you so much, Garnet. Thank you, Nima and I was really, really excited and just honored to, help out with this project. And it's just amazing to see what you guys have come up with. A lot of the findings that, you've shared definitely resonate with what I've seen in the work that I do. So Through the Eyes of African Women is a youth-led platform, and our goal is to support rising generations of African women, and specifically African feminist activists emerging and established by amplifying the wealth of knowledge that African women are creating through their everyday experiences, through their embodied experiences. And I actually never really thought about the term data until, I started maybe in the last year or so, but specifically when I started, when you came to me with this project. Previously, I'd always thought about it as, just knowledge. And I was, when I came up with Through the Eyes of African Women, I was working in the social movements lab at my university, Duke. And the lab is sort of premised on, this hybrid figure of the activist and scholar. And essentially it's about, documenting and analyzing social movements, the strategies that they use globally, and speaking with activists along, working alongside them to sort of produce knowledge that can be used to further movements. And so I kind of wanted to, adopt those same principles that we were using in the lab and channel them into young feminist organizing back home. And so with Through the Eyes of African Women, we've been using digital platforms and technologies to meet four major sort of goals, which is one, to educate, mostly around like just political issues, political realities, in specific countries, but also globally, to ensure that African women are represented as political actors, because you can't imagine what you can't see. And so there's just a huge gap in even like, who are the women who are organizing across the continent? Who are the feminists who are organizing? What principles are they using or enacting in their work? And what resources do they have access to? There's just not a lot of representation of our histories or our present day reality. So that was a really big thing. And then creating space to actually radically reimagine our communities, not just about, seeing things, seeing ourselves represented as political actors, but actually as people who are capable of building our worlds, building our communities, and challenging what currently exists. And then, channeling that back into sort of grassroots movements. So we focus on storytelling. So the first one is just sort of like creating digital spaces, online spaces for young women to share their political perspectives. And when I started Through the Eyes of African Women, one of the things that I was most surprised about was the fact that, when we opened up for submissions and said, we invited people to share, their political experiences. One of the things that we got was like a lot of poetry and prose and essays and personal letters. And, just thinking back to sort of like the histories of African women's organizing, fictional works and letters have always been really, really crucial ways that we document our experiences, we document our political perspectives. So it was really beautiful to see that being translated into the online space. And we had to like ask questions about how do we treat that sort of information? What is the place of, fictional works? What is the place of, personal letters and essays, and seeing that as like really relevant, still relevant towards feminist movement building, right? That we have a holistic, complex, nuanced pictures of young women's lives. The second is documenting and archiving. So actually working alongside grassroots movements to document what they're doing, everything from the origins of the movement, so how it started, what the intentions and visions were, what strategies they used, what the outcomes were, who were the actors who were involved, and actually being on the ground, speaking, collecting testimonies from activists, having discussions with them so that we understand holistically what it is that they were trying to achieve with their movement and where they hope to go and how they can be supported. So for example, with the Market March movement, we collected, some of our team members were actually participating in the movement at the same times that they were documenting, and we collected testimonies and things like that. And then we, ended up creating like a visual story so that we could share that, share those narratives back into the world. And then finally, knowledge sharing. So as Garnet sort of mentioned earlier, and Shania has also mentioned, there's a rise in sort of like online gender-based violence. And as much as digital spaces are really, really important for feminist activism, and they're really important spaces where, movements emerge, they're also places of, deep harassment, and not always the best for, they're great for catalyzing politicization, but not necessarily for sustaining it. So one of the things that we're working on is, creating spaces where we can have dialogue and organize and strategize online, and actually have intergenerational exchanges as well. So being able to build off the knowledge that has come, the knowledge that has been created by our predecessors, and do so in a way that is conducive to us feeling, allowing ourselves to be our whole selves and, come to the table as our whole selves, and to be feeling and sensing beings, and not just, cold in the way that we treat our narratives or treat information and treat data. So, yeah.
Right, and I'm hearing you talk about how Through the Eyes of African Women as a platform for young African feminists to share their stories in the forms of narratives and letters. And that resonates with our research where we talked about quantitative data being valued over qualitative data like that comes in these forms. And I'm wondering, how else does this report, how else does this research resonate with your work at Through the Eyes of African Women and as a young African feminist?
Yeah, I think so. Like I said, a lot of the findings in the report were really, just aligned perfectly with what I've been seeing. And I think that one of the biggest challenges is that we don't necessarily treat, qualitative, like you said, qualitative data, stories, as valuable. And not only do larger institutions not treat them that way, we don't, like as activists, as feminists, and as young people, we don't necessarily see it that way either. So there needs to be a lot of educating around, okay, yes, it is, completely valuable for you to interview some, like, for example, I'm really big on promoting participatory approaches, and as some of the other panelists mentioned, collaborative approaches to collecting data, to collecting narratives. It is, if you go to someone in your community, you interview the women in your community, that counts as important. The tweets that you share online count as important. The websites that you build are all extremely important, and we need to have spaces where those can, have a life beyond, the movement, for however long it lasts. And there needs to be a lot of educating around, technical skills. So even within our team, because it is youth-led and because it was like very kind of like scrappy, a lot of our team members didn't know how to use a lot of the digital tools that we needed. And we had like grand visions for how we were going to collect data. We had like participatory projects that we developed. We wanted to create these like digital timelines on African women's activism, and we wanted to do it in a way that, we invited people to volunteer, so that as we're creating these resources that can be used by anyone, you're also learning in the process. And those are all really amazing ideas, but, in terms of, okay, will you even be able to load the web page? Do you even know how to use the tools? Those are things that are really big challenges. And then I think another thing is the fact that for feminist groups, there's already a huge critique that African feminist groups are classist, and that they only represent, a small section of society. And obviously, I'm sure all of us are aware of the digital divide and the fact that so many people don't actually have access to these online spaces. And as much as we work with grassroots groups, the majority of our work sort of takes place online. So there just has to be, we have to rethink, what does it mean to be working with certain groups of people? What does it mean? Whose voices are being represented on our platforms? And what does it mean that, that we're treating that as like the knowledge that is going to inform our movements? I think it's sort of like over the last 2 years, I've been interviewing young Nigerian women activists. And one of the biggest things that they say is that although they become politicized online, and although they build their communities online, are able to see each other, and have feminist groups that become a lot more visible, they're in a couple of months or over the course of a year or so, they end up returning to, focusing primarily on on-ground work. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, Garnet.
No, you are answering the question.
Okay. Yeah, so yeah, it's just making space for all of those, the exchange between, grassroots on-ground work, and then also, what's happening online, and being able to accommodate those exchanges and have a really realistic view of who we're interacting with, and not taking for granted that we, are able to represent everyone's voices just by, working with whatever data or information we find online.
Right. That's really important. And a question for Nima from the chat. So someone is wondering whether where data, like examples of where data is extracted, but the benefits are not proportionally returned to the populations this data is extracted from.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that there's so many examples of that in the African context, where people collect data, they go into rural areas and they collect data, and there's no immediate benefit to the people whose data is collected, but there's also no long-term benefit. For example, there are a number of companies which will collect data and then put it into, for example, these data sets can be quite expensive, like understanding maybe energy use, and then they put it into these private data sets, which are actually quite expensive and that people have to pay for. But of course, there's no benefit to the people who provided that data. And another example that we also provide in the paper, which I've come across often, is that, for example, Ugandan researchers will work with foreign institutions, and the data will be collected from Uganda, but then these foreign researchers will go back to the institutions and publish academic papers, which are then not accessible to people in the African context, because many universities cannot pay the fees that are involved in subscribing to these different journals. And so then the students of the institutions, the people whose data was collected, are not able to access information which is collected from people in the African context. And actually, we in Mozambique, we actually spoke to a lecturer, and she was saying as well that she's had to resort to, for example, Russian websites to access knowledge. So I think it's twofold, where there's many examples where, for example, a startup company, the whole business model, of course, is like data extraction. We're going to collect data from farmers and we're going to sell it to maybe Coca-Cola or something, and that's very extractive in that way. But there's also the other side in terms of knowledge creation, where data that's produced, contents that's produced, is taken and it's monetized in foreign contexts, and you don't see any benefit coming to the people who created it or who have been involved or who it's collected from. So I think those are some examples of extractive practices. Over to you, Garnet.
Right. Sorry, I'm sure that a lot of us can relate to using all sorts of sites to get free academic journals. And Chennai, someone in the audience wants to know whether the people we talked to considered or mentioned the harms that could be brought about by automated system based on opaque algorithms. And they're also wondering if you could explain again what the role of Facebook was in our report.
Sure. So I'll start with the last one because it's the much more juicier one. The role of Facebook on this project was very limited. It was more so providing the funding, and they were also quite a consultative partner in terms of some of the things that we're thinking about, a sounding board. And I just want to add on, this is not the question that's asked, but I just want to add on, I think one of the things that we really thought about right from the beginning, and even something that was asked by the Facebook team, is that realization of who Facebook is in this conversation and who we are in this conversation, and acknowledging those power dynamics, and still trying to make sure that the work that we're producing is authentic and true to us being feminists, and also acknowledging the fact that, like, I think on realization, not many people are funding this. Not many people are actually funding work that's trying to understand how feminists make use of data and allow for it to us to write it in a way that, it really engages on the issues at hand, but doesn't necessarily fit with a particular agenda. So that's the first thing that I think is important to note, because this is something that we also had to like engage with Nima and myself when we were applying for this project. And then secondly, in terms of thinking about algorithmic harms, I think these were issues that were actually raised as what was experienced in these online spaces, not so named as because of the opaqueness of algorithms. So the shadow banning that was named as an issue when it comes to engaging on online platforms that a lot of feminists, sex workers, and queer people actually experience when they are engaging on the online space. And for us, like in the previous work that Nima has done, that I have done with my work on my data rights, these are issues that we know that actually exist. But what this research actually shows is that there's a need to take one step back as we're thinking about the issues around algorithmic harms and opaqueness of the space. For us, it's more so that understanding of data, right? Of the participation of our governance, of really understanding what it means to be part of the internet space or to be part of the technical space, and the data that we as people give up with data as bodies, and that experience that happens on these platforms, which then comes in the content moderation through algorithms, and actually not really knowing that this is what's happening. A lot of the times you find like anecdotal conversations around like, you know, it's the algorithm, or I've tricked the algorithm, because people have picked up on the language. But there is the sense that like, what do I do? How can I, you know, address the system? And for us in this research, the starting point was actually building more so that awareness of what data is, what it can be used for, and how people can have control, and actually thinking about more diverse governance on the issue of data that's inclusive and participatory and allows for feminists to actually like take control. I think one of the most important recommendations that came up with in terms of, you know, like the harms online, the algorithmic bias, the lack of data, who has control, is actually the need to hire feminists and have them in positions of power and in these places where then they can begin to look at the issues of harms, not just the technology, but the whole ecosystem itself in terms of who's participating, who's making the decisions, who has access, and, you know, some of the issues that Nima talked about, like the bias of not being actually able to access your own knowledge that you contribute to because of like a paywall in a journal. So yeah, so that's that. I hope that answers the question around like the algorithmic harms, as well as the role of Facebook in this project.
All right, thank you so much. There are a lot more questions in the chat, but unfortunately, we'll have to end this conversation here. But we are open to collaborations and partnerships and receiving more money for more research. And yeah, thank you so much for attending. And yeah, have a good evening or day, depending on where you are.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you all.